Good evening, folks. I call the April 26, 2022 special meeting to order. Madam City Clerk, would you be kind enough as to let the public know how to participate?
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight's meeting is available in person and available on our website and the government cable channels. The public can participate by attending the meeting in person, or they can log into Zoom. And the number for that is 1-669-900-9128, or log into zoom.us/join, and the meeting ID number is 978-4219-1797.
Thank you. Madam City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Jung.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Whitaker.
Here.
Councilmember Dunlap.
Here.
Councilmember Silva.
Here.
And Councilmember Zara.
Here.
And to give the invocation this evening, I'm going to invite Pastor Dwayne Evans of the Christian Life Center up. Pastor Evans, please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Let us pray. Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for all that you have done this far. So we just ask for your blessings over this meeting, for your wisdom and guidance over our city. So just bless each person that will take part in thy name. Amen.
Pastor Evans, if you want to stay at the podium, sir, and give us a little insight into your ministry, we'd certainly be grateful, sir.
Oh, yes. I have been officially the senior pastor of Christian Life Center for a year now. We're in the transition of better serving our community, and we're trying to find the best resources to do that for us homeless, for us needy. And so we're in the works of that. We're preparing for our outreach that we have in October. And so that's basically what we're doing. So it's an honor to stand before you, and thank you for the time.
We're blessed to have you in the community, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck with your good works.
All right, thank you.
If I may call on Councilman Zara to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Do any council members have any ex parte communications to report?
No.
Seeing none, move on to public comments. Are there any members of the public that wish to comment on the agenda this evening? Mr. Gamble.
Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council. My name is Curtis Gamble, activist for the homeless and the veterans. Today, I know we're talking about the budget, and so I just want to say before we even get started is that I would like to see within the budget that that our homeless population is included, and that that we stop ignoring them, and that we have the budgets set up to so that it won't totally ignore them. We have up to 300 homeless people on the streets, and in the last year, we have done pretty much nothing for them. Even though we have an emergency shelter that is being funded, $1,200,000, I think that's in the budget. But this shelter, the Elimination Foundation Navigation Center, has still only 50 Fullerton homeless. The rest of them are Santa Anas. So it's important that when we do our budget this evening, that we include them, our homeless community. I said it again. And also in our budget, I see no need to have the Fullerton Police Department in charge of our budget in dealing with the homeless people. I think we've kind of understand why. And if you don't, I'll just share 1 second. It's the Kelly Thomas thing. Many homeless people are still afraid, but they're still afraid of the police because of the Kelly Thomas situation. And so I would like to see our budget that we deal with the homeless people without including the police department and giving them all the funding or even Illumination Foundation, who only are taking care of 50 people. And again, I say this, when we do our budget, people who haven't come here, again, I'm talking about Illumination Foundation, and speak up for the money and say what they're doing, but yet we give them $1,200,000, which is just a reflection of what we're doing with our budget. We're not really paying attention. And again, the stop out, over there on Harbor and Commonwealth, we let this bar come, and we let that. I think we put it into our budget, but we break the law, which is just showing you, if we don't do this right, how are we doing our budget right? If we let them take up the sidewalk, which they're not supposed to, this is not right. What else are we doing that's not right that we just go along with? We cannot do that with public money. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Next commenter. Seeing none in chambers, we'll move on to Zoom.
No callers in Zoom.
Very well, we'll bring this back to council. Do any council members have any staff reports or council reports at all? Seeing none, we'll move on to the actual agenda item. Fiscal year 2022-23 budget study session. Who will give the presentation? Director Chang, please.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. Tonight's budget study session will focus on the proposed base general fund budget for fiscal year 22-23. The all funds proposed budget, which includes the general fund, will be submitted for City Council consideration on June 7th, and along with for adoption along with required GAN appropriation and fee schedule resolutions. This evening, Stephen Avalos, Budget and Purchasing Manager, will provide an overview of the budget process, highlight some of the City Council priorities for fiscal year 22-23 that were identified by City Council in February, review the revenue assumptions incorporated into the proposed general fund budget. Cindy Barrios, Budget Analyst, will highlight some department work plan goals, and I will then review the expenditure assumptions used to develop the proposed general fund budget and seek input from City Council, and then turn the presentation over to David Grantham, Principal Civil Engineer, to review some highlights of the citywide capital improvement plan for 22-23. Tonight's study session is to provide an overview of the proposed general fund and all citywide capital improvement plan budget for feedback or direction from City Council in preparation of the budget adoption in June. Before we begin, I would like to thank all department heads and their respective teams for the level of effort and support provided in development of the 22-23 budget. I would also like to thank Jeffrey Collier, Acting City Manager, Stephen Avalos, Cindy Barrios, and David Grantham for their collaboration in tonight's presentation. I will now hand the presentation over to Stephen Avalos.
Thank you. Before we get started, Mr. Avalos, very quickly for edification of the council members here, please hold your questions off until we've completed each portion of the presentation. It's a pretty lengthy one. So I think I've had it divided into 4 parts as far as I can see, so it'll make it a little bit easier to digest for all of us. And when that process concludes, we'll ask questions and make comments accordingly. But please save that until then so we can get through the presentation accordingly. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll start off tonight's fiscal year 22-23 budget study session by providing an overview of the budget development process for fiscal year 22-23. First off, the fiscal year 22-23 budget process is a collaborative citywide process in which all departments are responsible for developing their department budgets in conjunction with working with Finance and Administrative Services Department under the direction of the City Manager's Office. With that being said, the budget process officially began back in January 2022 under a maintenance of effort or MOE budget. And an MOE budget approach essentially allows budgets to increase for any merit and salary step increases, any approved agreements and contracts that have built-in annual increases, and any general costs of goods and services that are subject to a 2.5% cap increase. It also allows for any annual CalPERS retirement increases, as well as any internal service fund cost allocation increases. The basis of the fiscal year 22-23 proposed budget was developed under the context of implementing the City Council priorities in which public safety, infrastructure, and economic development were all deemed and identified as the top 3, which I'll talk a little bit more about these later in the presentation. Formal department work plans were also incorporated into the budget development process for fiscal year 22-23 and also serve as the basis of the proposed budget. I would be remiss not to mention that department work plans are not new concepts or set of operating plans to Fullerton. Departments have always operated under work plans and identified service levels for the community. Formalizing department work plans provide a uniform citywide document of all the city's service levels with respect to staff time and resources needed to support each department's ongoing efforts in providing services to the community. Further, work plans enhance operational and fiscal transparency for the community. Lastly, the budget adoption process, which usually consists of at least one budget study session and the budget adoption meetings that take place in June in order to adopt an annual budget before the start of the new fiscal year in July. As Ellis mentioned, tonight's study session will focus on the general fund, as it is the city's chief operating fund that provides your traditional municipal services, as well as an update on the city's proposed capital infrastructure plan for fiscal year 22-23. As I mentioned on the prior slide, the City Council priorities serve as the basis of the fiscal year 22-23 proposed budget. Over the course of several budget meetings in fiscal year 21-22, public safety, infrastructure, and economic development were identified as the top 3 City Council priorities. In addition, at a subsequent City Council meeting held on February 15th, there were also several other priority projects and programs that were identified and communicated to all departments to include within their department work plans and for formal inclusion in the fiscal year 22-23 proposed budget. Some of the project priorities include an economic development strategic plan, park safety improvements, cost recovery of services or revenue generating opportunities, arts programs, and open space management plans, to name a few. Before I hand the presentation over to Cindy to walk you through the department work plans, I will quickly outline the format of the work plans. Department work plans will identify each department's objectives and goals for the upcoming fiscal year, classified by priority and function, so that the city's vital resources or revenues are allocated accordingly. Work plans may include the day-to-day core operations and responsibilities, such as public safety and maintaining parks, any functions required by law, such as street sweeping or processing payroll, as well as any new department goals and initiatives for the new fiscal year. And now I will hand the presentation over to Cindy Barrios, our budget analyst, to go over the department work plans.
Thank you, Steve. Departments throughout the city have diligently worked on their respective work plans, but tonight I will only highlight a few from each department. The Administration Department, which is comprised of the City Manager's Office and City Clerk, will create a communication strategic plan to centralize communication and enhance public outreach. The department will also assist with the implementation of SB 1383, a new law that requires the recycling of organic products and facilitate the transition of the solid waste program to the Public Works Department. Administrative Services Department will work closely with a property tax consultant to better monitor and assess all residential and commercial property and will also provide audit recovery services. In addition, the department will implement Tyler Technologies' cashiering and billing software and enter into Phase 2 of the Central Square upgrade. Community and Economic Development will prepare an economic development strategic plan and assist with the development of key projects such as the Fox Theater, Fox Block, the Hub, Park West, and Goodman Logistics, to name a few. The fiscal year 22-23 budget assumes a unified fire command structure. A fee study will be conducted to support cost recovery efforts, and the department will upgrade the fire station alerting system, which is funded by ARPA. Human Resources will work alongside a consultant to lead a class and comp study to strengthen recruitment and retention efforts in the city. HR will also continue conducting citywide recruitments to fill vacant positions and help departments attain their staffing goals. The Information Technology Department will work on various IT improvements that were approved using ARPA, one of which includes an upgrade to the Fullerton Community Center AV system. The department will also continue performing ongoing IT infrastructure, support, and improvements. In the upcoming fiscal year, the Library Department will resume passport services with the use of ARPA funding. The Hunt Library will be restored, which will not only serve as a library, but also as a community asset for the arts and cultural programming. The library will also continue to distribute monthly STEM take-home kits for school-aged children and take-home preschool craft kits to support science and art for the youth community. Parks and Recreation will apply for and manage grants to aid parks, trails, and open space improvements and acquisitions. The department will also review program fees and contract classes to enhance programming while also supporting cost recovery efforts. Lastly, the department will begin a marketing campaign to increase donations for the Secret PAL Scholarship Program, which will provide free or reduced youth programs and classes for low-income students. The city's police department will continue to put our community's safety first as they work to preserve public safety. The police department will work with the North Orange County Public Safety Collaborative to provide homeless services and outreach to the community through Project Hope. In the upcoming fiscal year, the police department will continue to conduct trail patrol operations and will add a trail docent program using a retired senior volunteer program. Lastly, Public Works Department has planned various street rehabilitation and water projects with the support of ARPA funding, which David Grantham will speak about later in this presentation. In fiscal year 22-23, Public Works will also plan for parks and trails tree trimming for trees in high occupancy use areas. The department will work with the city manager's office to oversee the solid waste program, which will gradually transition throughout the year, and continue the implementation of SB 1383. So, all this to say, there are many great things happening in Fullerton, and this upcoming year is no different. I will now hand the presentation back to Steve, who will go over general fund revenues.
Thank you, Cindy. On this next slide, I will now present a high-level overview of the fiscal year 22-23 general fund revenues, in which I will then segue into the budget guiding revenue assumptions. On this general fund revenue table, I have outlined property tax, the general fund's largest revenue, sales tax, and TOT, as these are the city's other major tax revenues. All other revenues are categorized in large general areas to give you a high-level, big-picture overview of the general fund revenues projected for fiscal year 22-23 in comparison to the prior year actuals and against fiscal year 21-22 projected levels. As you can see from the table, general fund revenues are projected to be at $113.6 million for fiscal year 22-23, which is a $7.6 million increase from the adjusted fiscal year 21-22 revenue budget as presented at the mid-year budget back in February. We have subsequently adjusted our fiscal year 21-22 revenue projections to $110.3 million, in which Alice will touch upon this later in the presentation. Nonetheless, this is good news and a positive outlook that general fund revenues are trending in the right direction, in which the city is now at pre-pandemic growth levels. Next slide. On these next few slides, I will dive a little further into revenues and walk you through some of the major revenue assumptions. Property tax. As I mentioned earlier, property tax is the general fund's largest revenue at 46% of all general fund revenue and is projected to total $52.2 million in fiscal year 22-23. For fiscal year 22-23, we have factored in a conservative 1.5% increase on top of consistent 3% growth over the prior year. Property tax continues to be a reliable and stable revenue source for the city due to the city's strong property valuations here in Fullerton. For fiscal year 22-23, sales tax is a major revenue that is important to highlight and best illustrates the city's economic recovery from the pandemic. For fiscal year 22-23, sales tax is projected to total $29.4 million and reflects an increase of $1.9 million on top of a strong 17% increase from fiscal year 2021 actuals. The city's strong sales tax recovery has other contributing factors, but the quicker than anticipated economic recovery from the pandemic and current inflation levels are the primary reasons. Also, the city has benefited from new sales tax contributors doing business in the city and continue to receive increased county pool allocations as a result of the new state online sales tax law that was enacted back in 2019. Transient occupancy taxes, or more commonly known as TOT, is another revenue important to highlight, as TOT was another revenue source that was negatively impacted by the pandemic. TOT is projected to total $3.2 million in fiscal year 22-23 and is about 85 to 87% of pre-pandemic revenue levels, which is positive news. In addition, TOT revenues will be aided by the city's new short-term rental program, which was approved in fiscal year 2021 and applies TOT to short-term rental properties here in the city. The new STR program is anticipated to generate an additional $400,000 in TOT revenues in fiscal year 22-23. Lastly, now that restrictions have eased and we return to normal operating levels, fiscal year 22-23 will see a full return in the city's programming, facility rentals, and enforcement and citation revenues. I will now pause and see if there are any questions at this time.
Any questions from council? Councilman Silva.
Yes. On your charges for services, Parks and Rec, does that, I guess, imply that we're ramping up our Parks and Rec department? We're hiring when any type of fiscal recession hits or when we're losing funds, the first thing to go is Parks and Recs and Public Works. So I guess the question, does this take into account when you're saying we're going to full year of programming and enforcement? Does that mean we're going to how many are we going to rehire from pre-COVID? And is that and just how, what's the roadmap to get there? I guess to start providing some of these Parks and Rec services.
Let me touch on that. I'm actually going to have a report for you at your next meeting talking about Parks and Recreation Department. We've gone through and we've significantly slashed the department through COVID. Coming out of that, there's some opportunities on how we can re-envision the department moving forward and take advantage of focusing on how do we best serve our community, what types of programs are necessary, but also how can you create revenue engines within the department to as we provide those services. We don't provide many of the services the same way. Senior centers are a thing of the past in many respects, and that's evolved. The new generation of seniors aren't interested in eating a sandwich and playing billiards and playing cards. That's changed. Mm-hmm. And so we'll talk about some of those kinds of things going forward. We'll be looking for council direction and buy-in as we go forward. This will kind of set the table for it at our next meeting.
All right. And just follow up, when you say re-envision, I mean, this is what sometimes causes me concern is, are we looking at contracting out, or are we looking to hire within and create our full service city that we have?
I think you're going to be looking at a combination. I think there's opportunities to definitely hire, and there's a need to hire within. And you may be looking at, in some cases, contract classes and things like that, where you bring in contracted instructors, which you were already doing. And so I don't see that changing dramatically. But you definitely need to deepen your bench because you've dissipated in many of your employees. And as we look at this and as we look at these opportunities to create revenue engines, you'll be able to actually recapture more revenue and have the department actually return more revenue back to cover their expenses. And then I think as you go forward, you'll have a deeper bench to be able to look at returning to some of the bigger events that we've had to forego, and you'll have the staffing to be able to do that. So hold the thought, but I think that those are some items that I think are very important going forward for the city to look at.
Yeah, well, it triggered it when I saw full year programming. And just one last note, and I asked this because during Easter weekend, my wife went out to 3 or 4 Easter events that were put on by different cities from their community, from their Parks and Rec, and we had nothing. So if
Yeah.
it's out there in those cities and they're doing it within staff, I think we're a big enough city and it looks like we're generating enough funds to bring back that atmosphere that we are providing services and activities to our residents.
We're going to be talking about a number of these things. Yes, we have gone down quite a bit. We probably have around, I think we're down to 8 full-time employees in Parks and Recreation right now. That is not sustainable if we're going to be having an active department that is going to be providing a number of services out there. So we're going to be talking about this, like I say, at the next meeting.
Thank you.
You guys budget a recruiter or somebody to actually work in the HR department? I mean, if there's that many openings, maybe
Well,
that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'll be the second step after we have this conversation at the next meeting.
It's like we hear about this stuff all the time. How about do something about it, you know? That's the thing that gets the most frustrated, you know? Sit up here and hear people complain, and then you give solutions, there's solutions available, resources available, and people not taking advantage of them, and then the community suffers as
Yeah.
a result of it. It's frustrating.
Yeah, and to your point, Councilmember Dunlap, I know that you had mentioned that one of your friends called up and said, the city's dirty. You mentioned, and so we need to get on that. And one of the things that you've mentioned, Jeff, was that our starting rate, we're not able to recruit because Starbucks, Target, whomever is paying a lot more than we are. So I think we've got to also look at that if we want to bring in some quality people that will take pride in the city.
That's one of the items that's in your work plan here. If you look under HR, one of the items is a classification and compensation study. And that's going to go to the heart of seeing, are we competitive and where do we need to be?
Thank
All
you.
right, any other questions from council?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor,
Councilman
if
Zorn.
I may. Yeah, I do have some comments, but I'm going to leave them to the end. But I do have some questions here on the process a little bit. I know that last year when you were doing the sales tax projections, you were very conservative in that. And I know we talked about potentially having numbers that are often because of the conservative approach. How conservative are you now with your numbers? And then, so that's my first part. And the second part is, what are we looking at? Because we had the luck of getting the ARPA funds. That was a huge part of rescuing our city. In addition to a good, solid recovery after COVID for businesses. So those really saved us in a sense. But when we're looking at long-term projections, have you been able to see anything beyond the 3-4 years that we have currently?
Councilmember, currently, we're not presenting a long-term forecast because we're seeing a lot of changes in the last few quarters and working with our sales tax consultant. So to answer the first part of your question is the current sales tax projections, in our opinion, is not, it's fiscally conservative using the best estimates that we have to date. And we're seeing signs of the economic recovery. So that's based on the latest sales tax meeting from the Q4 2021 meeting we had with our consultant.
The reason I'm asking this is because if we are too conservative, if we're not as close to reality, what will end up happening is we're making decisions here and cuts and oftentimes decisions on staffing levels and so on based on these projections. And there was, I think, a knee-jerk reaction several, quarters ago which I believe contributed to the discussion of the major cuts that happened. So I just want to make sure that we are as accurate as possible in our projections and not having them come later on way over than what we thought.
As Steve Avalos had mentioned, the city does work actively with the sales tax consultant. At the beginning of the pandemic, the actual consultant actually came in with sales tax projections lower than what we actually budgeted for back in 2021. And I think this finance staff working with the city manager's office kind of hit the mark regarding sales tax. The reality is right now, sales tax revenues with the reopening have kind of skyrocketed beyond what we had initially anticipated at the beginning of 21-22 when we were looking at budget development back in early 21. We did at mid-year increase the sales tax numbers up to 27.5 million. For fiscal year end 21-22, we're looking at ramping that up an additional $1 million for this fiscal year end. And based on the sales tax consultant's projections, we're looking at 29.4 million for 22-23. The sales tax consultants right now, based on our the number of businesses currently operating in the city, I think are a little bit, the recessionary picture on the horizon is kind of tempering where we're looking at for subsequent years for 23, 24, and beyond. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't know when that recession is going to hit, but there's a lot of anticipation that it will hit sooner than later. I think usually with the recessionary impact, governments tend to lag about feeling the impacts of it for about a year or so. So I think based on the proposed 22-23 budget and the fact that we have ARPA to help stabilize some government operations, it gives us a little cushion to withstand that over the next 2 fiscal years. I think from this chart here on slide 8, we were very conservative with our property tax budget for 21-22. We did ramp that up quite significantly given how hot the housing market has been. Property values are continuing to be reassessed as they turn over, and we're anticipating seeing that continued growth into 23-24 as well. But we'll be bringing forth a 5-year projection when we submit the budget for adoption in June.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from council? Please move forward.
In addition, the city will benefit from new revenues in fiscal year 22-23. In fiscal year 21-22, the city council approved 2 new electronic billboard agreements, which will generate approximately $200,000 in new public benefit fees to the general fund. In fiscal year 21-22, the city council also approved an increase in the cost recovery for all community and economic development-related user fees. This is anticipated to generate an additional $400,000 in fiscal year 22-23. In addition, Public Works will soon be taking cost recovery fee increases for their user fees before the end of the fiscal year. These estimates have not been factored in at this time, and depending on timing and if approved, the general fund revenues may be adjusted in time for budget adoption in June.
And Steve, just one quick question, that $0.4 million from the community economic development, that's just to recover our costs, right? So it's not going into the general fund per se, it's, we use the personnel and then this is how we pay them, correct?
Well, the revenues do go into the general fund, but the cost of services is being performed in the general fund. So
Okay.
simply, we're recovering the amount of money that we should be, that we haven't historically been recovering.
We're
recovering our
reducing how
costs.
much we've been subsidizing out of the general fund for those services.
Got it, thank you.
The city will continue to evaluate all cost recovery efforts and revenue generating opportunities in fiscal year 22-23. Transfers in are also important this year as it'll assist in balancing the budget for fiscal year 22-23. In fiscal year 22-23, the general fund will receive a $300,000 repayment from the Brea Dam Fund from a prior year subsidy made in fiscal year 19-20. ARPA revenue replacement. $2.6 million of the council approved $9.6 million of ARPA revenue replacement will be applied and utilized to stabilize government finances in fiscal year 22-23. Alice will touch upon this a little more in her slides. but due to the city's improved revenue intake for fiscal year 21-22, no use of ARPA revenue replacement is anticipated to be used for fiscal year 21-22. And this leaves us approximately $7 million in ARPA revenue replacement available for subsequent years or to reallocate to other projects or program areas. And now I will hand the presentation over to Alice to discuss expenditure assumptions and the preliminary general fund projection.
Thank you, Steve. So in these next two slides, we're going to be covering present the revenue assumptions used to develop the 22-23 budget. I'm actually not going to be covering them with these two slides presented here tonight. I'll discuss these as we go through slide 13, which is essentially going to map out how those expenditure assumptions were built in developing the 22-23 budget. So here on slide 13, this table presents fiscal year 2021 actuals, 21-22 adjusted mid-year budget, projected fiscal year end 21-22 as of updated numbers available as of April 20th, and then the revenue assumptions and then that Steve and Avalos had reviewed, as well as expenditure assumptions that were used to develop the 22-23 proposed general fund budget before you tonight. So before we begin, I'd like to just quickly walk through the chart on screen. That first blue row is available beginning fund balance. That is essentially what is set aside for contingency reserve as well as any unassigned fund balance to start the beginning of the fiscal year. This number does not tie to ending fund balance for 2021 in the ACFR, because the ending fund balance in the ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, includes restricted, non-spendable, as well as other fund balance that has been assigned by City Council for special projects or programs. The next green row is, the first green row is the operating surplus or deficit, and this number is essentially the difference between revenues and expenditures. Transfers in and out present movement of interfund activities. And the second green row right below that is essentially our net change in fund balance. In budget development, the resulting goal is to adopt a balanced budget with a neutral or positive net change in fund balance figure. The light orange section at the bottom presents the amount needed to achieve contingency reserves at either the minimum or the goal of 17%. The last line, presented in bold font, is essentially whether or not the city has achieved its 17% contingency reserve level. So in looking at that first column, actuals for fiscal year 2021, general fund ended fiscal year with a positive $2.3 million net change in fund balance, supporting an increase to contingency reserves at about a 13.5% reserve level, or about $13.3 million. This is the starting point for fiscal year 21-22, as shown in the first blue row labeled available beginning fund balance in both the second and third columns. The second row is the adjusted fiscal year 21-22 budget, and this presents the updated mid-year budget presented to City Council in February, at which time revenue estimates were adjusted upwards by about $5 million. This $5 million increase at mid-year was due to sales tax estimate increases of about $3.9 million, TOT increases of about $1 million, as well as the about $160,000 and fee budgeted revenues for building and planning fees that were adopted by City Council. The third column, labeled projected fiscal year 21-22, presents updated revenue and expenditures estimates as of April 20th, and you can see that the revenue estimates were adjusted by an additional $4.3 million from the mid-year estimate. This is primarily due to property and sales tax respective increases of $2.2 million and $1.1 million, and this is where we anticipate, as of now, to end fiscal year 21-22. In addition to that, building and planning revenues were also adjusted upwards by about $100,000 due to approved fee increases. Other than negotiated labor adjustments, which will be reviewed shortly, no other significant adjustments to the fiscal year 21-22 projected fiscal year-end budget are currently known and anticipated. With an increase of $4.3 million in general fund revenue projections for the current fiscal year, The initially anticipated need to apply $4 million of ARPA to stabilize government operations as a budget balancing measure has been removed from the fiscal year 21-22 year-end projection, as shown in the third column, with the transfers in from ARPA for government operations zeroed out. So as of now, the general fund is projected to end fiscal year 21-22 balanced without need for ARPA, and at the City Council directed 17% general fund contingency reserve level. So now for the meat and potatoes of this evening, the proposed fiscal year 22-23 budget. The last column essentially presents the proposed general fund budget and anticipated impact on contingency reserve levels. As Steve mentioned, general fund revenues have continued to recover throughout the current fiscal year and is also anticipated to continue into fiscal year 22-23. This growth has essentially been due to quicker than anticipated pandemic recovery, including restoration of city programs, increased real property assessed valuations, as well as the addition of new businesses operating and generating sales tax revenue within the city. The increase in online sales tax distributions from the county pool, and on the flip side of inflation, the benefit of higher prices also translates into more sales tax revenue. The proposed 22-23 general fund budget was developed with a revenue estimate of about $113.6 million. This figure is moderately conservative in terms of property tax revenue and user fee estimates, specifically in developer and permit fees. I do anticipate that property tax revenues will most likely be higher, but we will bring that back at probably mid-year after adoption in 22-23, once we're able to start working with our property tax consultant. And then further, if City Council also moves to approve cost recovery for public works fees, which will be submitted for City Council consideration sometime in May, and we receive that direction in time for final budget development for the 22-23 budget, this revenue estimate will also be adjusted upwards. The proposed 22-23 general fund expenditure budget includes a base budget of $109.2 million. That was developed with incorporation of the $3.8 million of vacancy savings and the additional 2.5% budget reductions. These position and operating reductions identified will be held unfunded in 22-23. Included also in the budget is an increase for estimated wage adjustments from annual merit increases, as well as some budget additions and changes to move forward City Council priority projects. In addition, we are planning to implement the city's cost allocation plan in 22-23. So there's a grossing up of some expenditures in general fund, which are going to be recovered through cost allocations from all the other city funds back to the general fund. And the net benefit of implementing that cost allocation plan is a net recovery or net positive to the general fund of about $600,000. Expenditure impacts above the base expenditure budget are in that second section labeled expenditures, which are the negotiated labor impacts. An increase of about $1.5 million to the expenditure budget from negotiated labor impacts that were approved in 21-22. It's important to note that salary and benefit impacts from negotiations which have not yet concluded have not been factored into the proposed general fund budget. An increase of $1 million to the expenditure budget from the termination of the Fullerton-Brea Shared Command Agreement. After the 08-09 recession, as a cost savings measure, the City of Fullerton and the City of Brea entered into a shared fire command agreement whereby the fire chief, emergency medical services manager, and division chiefs would provide operational support for both agencies. With the termination of the shared command agreement, Fullerton has included in the 22-23 budget full cost of a fire chief, the addition of emergency medical support, as well as the addition of 2 battalion chiefs to provide continuity of fire and paramedic services to the City of Fullerton. Additionally, that $1 million increase also includes reinstating 4 firefighter positions. The estimated revenue of about $113.6 million is sufficient to support the base budget expenditure, as well as the 2 aforementioned expenditure increases, which total $111.8 million. The last significant increase to the proposed general fund expenditure budget is an increase of $2.5 million. The city's liability program is anticipating to increase $4.7 million in fiscal year 22-23. Of this $4.7 million increase, $2.5 million is attributable to the general fund. The increase to the liability program is the result of premium as well as self-insurance retention increases. While boosting revenues, inflation also impacts operating and capital costs. Inflationary pressures are anticipated to continue to impact the city's costs into 22-23, and any such significant cost increases will be brought forward as a mid-year adjustment during 22-23. That middle section labeled transfers in and out. Transfers in and out, so the transfers in include annual transfer from the Traffic Safety Fund to support traffic signal maintenance and operations. And as Steve mentioned, a one-time reimbursement from the Brea Dam Fund for a prior year subsidy, as well as an anticipated $2.65 or $2.7 million of ARPA that was approved by City Council for budget balancing. The transfers out is the transfer of half of the baseline increase in sales tax and secured property tax revenues to the infrastructure fund that was established by City Council a few years ago. With that, the city's general fund contingency reserves is still anticipated to maintain a 17% contingency reserve level at the end of fiscal year 22-23. I know this is a lot of information to take in, so I'll pause now to address any questions.
I have a few before we get to the rest of the council. We have a liability insurance increase over just one fiscal year of $2.5 million. What does that do? Where is that coming from?
It is primarily due to premium increases. The increase in the liability program citywide, as I mentioned, was $4.7 million. This cost gets allocated based on claims history across all city funds, and 2.5 of that 4.7 increase is attributable to general fund.
But every city has claims. Every business has claims. I fall in Walmart, there's a claim. 2.4 on top of, or 2.5 on top of 4.7, you said?
The 2.5 is included in that 4.7.
Included in the
Yeah.
4.7. That's a very large increase.
That is correct.
What are we doing to mitigate these things? What, outside of hiring our good Director Manfro to head up HR, what are we doing to kind of mitigate some of this cost? Because this is a lot of money that's being tossed for no good reason, I find.
So I'm actually going to hand over the podium to our HR Director, Mr. Manfro.
To address your comments, it is frustrating to observe, but the reality is due to poor claims history of the city was dropped by an excess liability carrier, and we had to go out to the market, and two things occurred. Number one, the premium was increased significantly. Number two, our self-insured retention was also increased. We went from a $2 million self-insured retention, which for all intents and purposes is a deductible, to $4 million. So we own the first $4 million of any claim at this point going forward. So that requires us to reserve a lot more money and have on hand. So the combination of premium increases and the actuarial impact of having a self-insured retention of $4 million is very, very significant. When you look at where the claims are coming from, and I think you will understand this based on updates we've given you, we have a pretty complicated and old infrastructure in Fullerton, and some of those property damage claims have been fairly catastrophic. So right now we're in a tough time with the insurance market, and the best we can do is keep shoring up our infrastructure, doing the best we can with our risk management practices, but we're going to have to weather the storm for a few years.
All right, one other thing. Thank you, Director Manfro, for that. The cost of doing business for our city is only going to increase. Our current budget projection has us operating at a deficit again, this time $700,000. It is best practices that a city of our size continue to maintain a 17% contingency reserve, so I'm not willing to bleed into that in any way. Revenue generated by new businesses is finite and requires time to generate. Any and all cost-cutting measures at this time will only become a net negative for the expectation of services from our residents and businesses. We've already done 2.5 already this year. So it's a requirement that we try and act boldly and with certainties to continue to improve public trust in local government. We need to continue to prove that we are capable of being good stewards with the public's money. A practical solution that I am proposing this evening that can close the $700,000 deficit gap is the fee associated with hotel usage, the TOT tax. Currently, Fullerton's TOT tax rate is only 10% by comparison. A comparable city of our size, Orange, is 15, Anaheim 15 plus 2, Buena Park 12. We can add a new revenue stream just to bridge the gap that exists with our current revenue and expenditure expectations. So I'm directing staff this evening to investigate a TOT tax increase to be placed on this year's election ballot. I'd like to know the costs and the projected revenue for the city, costs of putting it on the ballot, that is. If we are to modernize our aging city, it's just as important that we modernize our revenue and service costs as well. So let's move forward there. And with that, I'll give this back to the remainder of the council. Councilman Zara.
Yeah, just a point to clarify, this requires a ballot measure, I'm assuming, yes. And does that mean it requires 4 votes from council to put it on the ballot? Or just 3? Because I know a sales tax requires 4.
Thank you, Councilmember. I do believe it would be 4 because it's a finance measure.
4, okay. All right, well, that would be a discussion for another time. But I don't necessarily have any particular questions yet. I don't know if the presentation is over yet or not, but we can continue. I don't have any questions at this point.
Well, Councilman Silva, anything, sir?
Just one, Mr. Manfred, when you mentioned that, back to the liability issue, Mayor, a part of it was because we have an aging infrastructure, and I know I've heard that from the day I got on the dais here in 2016. And I know we allocated a lot of funds to street maintenance, but is there, to stop this bleeding, do you believe we need to, or city manager, to allocate funding to the water mains that break and flood a house, and then we have to go out there and subsidize that or fix that, or the sidewalks that the trees uplift, people trip, and then they come to council? So just because, and I know that right now we're having a lot of concerns with some of the street lighting. If they're dark and someone trips, then we're on the hook as well, correct? For something like that, if our lights aren't on?
So I'm not going to weigh in on council priorities and how to spend your money. I'm just simply going to say from a risk management standpoint, the infrastructure and layout of the city does cause us some significant claims. Obviously, if we have less sewer backups, less water main breaks, less trip and falls, less catastrophic accidents out on our trails and our roads, then our liability exposure goes way down. So how we address that is obviously a conversation to be had in the years to come. But certainly those conditions out there in the field are certainly causing us issues.
Yeah. No, thank you. Just wanted to get that on the record, because I know we have allocated a lot of funds for street repair, but I think it's minimal for the other infrastructure needs that we have and will continue to have.
This is nothing new that other cities haven't faced. There are different ways that other cities address it. Some will utilize a bond process. Glendora went through this. They had leaky water lines all over their town, and they actually couldn't afford to do it as a pay-as-you-go approach or anything. They had to bond and do a massive project. And they're a much smaller city, but it still was very expensive for them. Other cities will take and increase water rates and utilize that and do a pay-as-you-go approach. That's another option. Some cities will do a sales tax measure and target a chunk of that money to go towards infrastructure improvements or public safety, things like that. So there's different formulas for different cities, and that's something that I would say Fullerton needs to have that conversation going forward. How are you going to pay for this? Because it needs a sustained investment over time.
Very well. And by no means is Councilman Silva advocating that anybody sue the city. Any other comments?
Never said that.
Yeah, I know. Don't give anybody any suggestions. Councilman Dunlap, anything, sir?
No, I'll wait till the end.
All right, very well. Please continue.
I think with that, I will now hand the presentation over to David Grantham to provide an overview of the citywide all funds capital improvement plan for 22-23.
I appreciate Councilman Silva's transition there as we talk about construction. So obviously, going to talk very high level here. I'm not going to go into detail of every single proposed CIP project. We did that a couple weeks ago with INRAC, but I will highlight kind of the major categories that we're dealing with next year. Oops, next slide. So we'll start with streets, our favorite topic. You'll notice we got 5.5 million of ARPA, and probably your first question is, hey, I gave you 13.1. Why is it only 5.5? Well, I'm using hope to use approximately 2 million of it this fiscal year, and then I'm spreading the remaining 11 over the next 2 years. Reason for that is, as we've discussed before with council and with INRAC, our intent is to do street improvements following our utility replacements, and then if we have the ability to do any other streets that are not impacted by old utilities, we will do that as well. So if you go to the next slide, please. This kind of points out how I'm doing this. So anything in blue is Arterial Streets, which will be funded either by SB1 or a federal grant, which came from OCTA, or in the case that I just talked about, a street project which isn't affected by old water mains, that would be Brookhurst at the 91. Anything in green are utility projects and funded by ARPA. There's a lot up there, so if we didn't have the ARPA funds that council provided, we would be in a lot of hurt next year as far as street improvement projects are concerned, because the only ones we would be able to do are the ones in red. Next slide, please. So obviously we have infrastructure other than streets. The water infrastructure has been told many, many times, needs a lot of TLC and a lot of replacement, so there's a lot of money going towards that, coming from the water fund. We also have the sewer and storm drain infrastructure. 1.7 seems like a decent amount of money for our sewer system. It is acceptable because we've done a lot of work in the past. We have a pretty decent system right now. But the issue here is that over time our revenues are pretty stagnant. Our operating costs are going up, our maintenance costs are going up, which means there's a decrease of money coming to CIP. Exactly the same thing with the storm drain infrastructure. Actually, this year or next year we're proposing, typically the CIP money comes from what's left over from the sanitation fund. I actually will not be getting any CIP money from sanitation, so the money we're requesting is actually going to be coming from the reserves of the capital drainage outlay fund, which is obviously not the way we want to go about doing this. But we're doing that because we're in the process of reviewing the fees and the revenue related to that, so we hope this is a one-time effort to go into the reserves. Next slide, please. Showing where we're doing the water and sewer. The blue, obviously water. A lot more water mains, but you can see if you go compare it to the the street slides, they do line up. So as was mentioned before, we're following that. The only two places that do not line up is up on the top. There's a Mark III area, that's HOA, those are private streets, so I don't get to do anything there. And then Hermosa area at the very top, I'm waiting until the following year because we're going to do additional water main work the following fiscal year in that area, so I'd rather bring in the heavy trucks on our streets one time.
And what street is that? Is that
Which
La
one?
Palma? That one up in the Hermosa area?
Yeah, trying to remember what the cutoff is. One's La Palma and the other one is Hermosa. I think that is, that's Hermosa because you can see the blank square. That would be Hermosa Park.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Other areas of infrastructure, our traffic systems, we do need to keep our traffic systems up and running, so a lot of our equipment is end of its useful life, so we need to replace it and do upgrades. You'll notice that we use M2 and gas tax for our traffic. Those are eligible expenses. We do not generate enough traffic mitigation fees to really offset the needs of the traffic systems. But we do take advantage of OCTA grants as much as possible, which includes those two projects shown below, the synchronization, which actually goes through multiple cities. Next slide, please. And then almost at the end, our facilities and parks. We have a lot of buildings, so we do have to do pretty extensive maintenance and renovation on those buildings, such as updating HVAC, roof replacements, painting, flooring replacements. And then as far as our park system is concerned, I spent a lot of time with Alice this year. We are not proposing any major renovation of existing parks. We're looking more at replacing the equipment and the facilities that we have in our parks, rather than a full-scale renovation. And next slide. And then finally, I kind of like this little chart. It's an overview of where our funds are being spent. So the restricted funds, as in the past, is the vast majority of the CIP budget. On the table to the right, I want to point out the water fund. That is 40% of our budget next year. The next highest is ARPA at 17. So if we didn't have the ARPA funds allocated by council, again, it'd be a lot. I wouldn't be as happy as I am standing up here, and I wouldn't say I'm ecstatic by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, I think, sometimes graphics tell a story, and this is the story I want to tell. With that, I'll take any questions or any specifics on the CIP.
Mr. Mayor, if I may?
Mr. Councilman Silva, Zara, go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry.
So I have a couple of questions here. If you can go back to the image of the street projects. So, and I'm going to be channeling here residents of South Fullerton.
Yes.
If I may, because I know you have a process and there's some technical issues and that you have to abide by in order to select the roads. But from a resident's perspective, you look at this map and the majority of the ARPA funds are going to the north side. And I know that I don't like to make this argument as much, but that is a sentiment that nonetheless exists in our city, and I'd like you to maybe address it here for the
Absolutely.
for the record. Yes.
It's interesting you bring that up because I had that conversation with Meg about a month ago. When you look at this map, it's not pretty for someone who lives on the south side versus the north side. What I can do is bring a map that shows what we've done over the last couple of years, what we're planning on doing in the next few years, because I do really make an effort to be as equitable as I can moving through the city and trying to do everything as much as I can without focusing on one certain area.
Because
the water projects are dictating where we're going, and I have made comments to our water division looking at their projections to move some projects from different years to move them around to provide a more equitable location. The downside is the vast majority of the problems we have with our water main are on the north side. So it is a bit of a catch-22. Certainly don't want, I really feel we do not ignore the fact that we're trying to be as equitable as possible. We do make that effort. I think we've made that effort over the past few years, and we will strive to do that in the following years. I'll be more than happy to bring back an exhibit that kind of shows where we've been and where we're going.
Yeah, I would like that because I can literally hear the response to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And if I may, I have a couple more questions.
Actually, before you get to yours, I wanted to piggyback on what you were saying and have him expand on something, sir.
Sure.
So let's just do just street improvement projects, do a best-case scenario, pie-in-the-sky thing. If we had all the money in the world, what's the maximum amount of mileage, let's say, we could do of street repair without crippling the city? Just so our residents have an idea that we can't just overnight snap our fingers
The
and get
the
a street
discussions
repaired.
we've had in the past is a budget of about $20 million.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the time frame to get the project done, it's the concrete work you have to do, in combination with the disturbance to the public. Could we do more? Absolutely. Discussions with INRAC, that was kind of along those lines of in that budget-ish area, but I'll be more than happy to take more money. But then you run into okay, are we going to take the risk of paving over a street that has a water main that was built in 1960?
Sure. All right, very good. Thank you, Councilman Zara. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, and that was going to be somewhat similar to what you just asked, Mr. Mayor, which is the miles of road. I mean, I know you're proposing 11 million now as far as this, but you said we could potentially handle up to
Yeah, and
20. Maybe I'd want to know what the logic is for this not having a little bit more.
Spending more money now,
Yeah.
as opposed to spreading it over years. It really, when you look at the streets that I'm looking to target this year, all right, let me put it this way. I looked at this year and next year. So the following year, I want to do a preservation project where I'm also focusing on streets that are in decent shape. And part of that is some of these projects, some of these streets where we're doing the water main replacement, they are decent pavements. So I have a strategy as to why I want to spread this out over 2 years. If we came back and spent more money now, I would be paving over, or we would be paving over streets that we would be taking the risk with our water main.
All right, fair enough. And how many miles right now of road are we going to be this year doing, and how many miles do we need still?
I have not calculated what the mileage is this year, unfortunately.
Okay. And then the last question I have is, and I know you've got a couple of years worth of projects that you're strategizing over the use of this ARPA funds, and like you said, thank God for the ARPA funds, right?
Absolutely.
We would not have survived without that. But what do you think of long term, beyond the couple of years?
Well, that is the part. I mean, infrastructure is not a one-time issue. It's not in my opinion, you can bond for something and get a lot of work done, but it's not something you do once and walk away. You need a significant annual budget to maintain everything in a constant manner. I go back to the time we spent with INRAC, and basically the idea is to have an extra $30 million a year, every year from now forever, for our infrastructure. And that would be to do a decent job of keeping up. That would not be, more money would be better, but the discussions, how to raise that amount of money, that was kind of the quote-unquote sweet spot as to that's how much money we need on an ongoing annual basis to address our infrastructure needs and then to maintain the infrastructure.
So one could say this budget doesn't necessarily address the actual need, but when it comes to capital improvement projects.
It absolutely doesn't, but it is a lot better than what I was expecting.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be so parochial as to claim that the South is being shortchanged. Anytime we look at a single-year budget, we're looking at a snapshot, and it ignores the last 2 or 3 prior years. We have had significant improvement on Orangethorpe, on Brookhurst, on so many heavily trafficked streets in the south side of the city, arterials in particular. One thing that troubled me last year when I served as mayor was to find out that our focus on arterials, which was helping the most people in our city and the most throughput, was damaging our chances of obtaining grants, because grants are often provided with heavily trafficked areas. And so that was a little bit troublesome. And so I'm glad to see focusing a little bit in some neighborhood areas here for the time being. The south part of the city, however, does bear a disproportionate amount of traffic adjacent to the 91 freeway and also even with the 5 freeway junction, so nearby, and much more heavy truck traffic as well. And we're aware of this with some of the development efforts out on the east side of the city right now, the increase in heavy truck traffic that we will experience soon. But what my question was going to be about initially was M2. It seems as though M2 funds, there was a great promise from M2 back then, and right now the amounts seem rather paltry that a city the size of Fullerton is able to obtain from M2. And is that greatly underperformed what your expectation had been?
To be honest, I don't know what my expectation was. It's been pretty consistent for the 5+ years I've been here. Obviously, other cities, you look at the breakdown of what they get versus what we get. They get a lot more. It's based on population and sales tax. So they have a formula. Is it fair? Anyone can argue whether that's fair or not. I think there are other arguments that could be made, but that's a lot of political maneuvering to make adjustments to how things are allocated.
Yeah, it's an easy calculation, basically, that additional sales tax that we've extended through M2, how much proportionately is spent in Fullerton versus what we receive back. Now, obviously, we contribute as well to freeways and to other areas throughout the county in that process. But that's, and then the last thing is, I'm glad that you talked about ongoing expenditures necessary for infrastructure. We've been, for several decades here in Fullerton, deferring and ignoring maintenance and replacement costs. In my opinion, they need to be built into regular budgets. To act otherwise is to pretend that you don't have that responsibility. And no one else will pick up the ball for us on that. It is our responsibility. So to get budgets a little bit truer in terms of over time, and you can't do it all at once, but to keep moving in that direction of utilizing and even contributing more general funds to infrastructure purposes, that's been my top priority since I've been on the council. Thanks for your report. That $20 million you're talking about annually would be a little over 20 miles probably, right? At today's costs.
Probably, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councilman Silva.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to add to what Councilman Zara and Mayor Potem mentioned about South Fullerton, yeah, I was just going to say, I do recall prior maps where we were doing a lot of work down there, and given that I was in District 3 this weekend, and there were some questions as to when are you going to fix some of our streets and alleys? And when they get to the alleys, I said, well, those are at the bottom of the list, so we'll have to figure that out. I know it's tough, but thank you for showing this and giving us a look into the future. And then one question I had that I've been trying to call Meg and I haven't, down in the College Street, Yale, we were doing the water main, and then we were doing the street, and then it stopped. And I think now, are we doing the fiber optics? Is that why we kind of slowed it down?
Well, yeah, we purposely broke the project up into two, the water and then the streets, because I feel like I'm getting better bids that way. But the water finished, and then Sci-Fi was not in yet, so we made the adjustment and pushed them. So they're installing right now, and then I think in 2 weeks, the street improvement project starts.
Okay, yeah, no, because I was wondering why it had stopped, and then the other day I saw the micro trench.
Yep.
And I go, oh, why? And then, so I guess since we're repairing the street, the micro trench doesn't have to be right up to the cement, right to the curb part?
Our standard puts it up against the curb, but there may be spot locations where we're bowing out for specific
in that area, everything is going out about 1 foot to 18 inches away from the curb.
I'd have to find out why. There must be something already right there.
And some of them are going wider, just because I walk that every morning.
Sometimes we're doing that because we know we're removing the curb and gutter coming up to repair it, so they may be just moving it out of the way.
All right, well, anyway, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I could.
Councilman Dunlap, sir.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're, an hour and 15 minutes into the presentation, and we finally get to think what's arguably, at least in my view, and I think many people's view, the most important part of the evening. So, perhaps next year or in future presentations, you'll get the bigger and perhaps earlier window in the presentation. But I think what's interesting, I know one of the first slides that was shown featured, I think, 5 different priorities, right, for the city. I just found it amusing that apparently at a previous meeting, there were things like economic development, park safety, cost recovery or fee-generating items, arts, and natural open space, all of which are important. But I think arguably what we see time and time again, the biggest issue and the biggest concern for Fullerton residents and businesses, which is road and street conditions, was not included amongst that. And so I just think any time something like that is published or shown, I think it's just doing a disservice to our community. I think it just makes people realize, it makes people think, I think that people here at City Hall, whether it's council, whether it's staff or what have you, are tone deaf and don't get it. And so I think, look, the reality is, we need to continue to invest as much money as we can in our roads, streets, and infrastructure, whether that's through grants or whether that's through a funding mechanism built into our own budget. Obviously, as Mayor Pro Tem had mentioned, this isn't something that just happened overnight, but we can take those steps within our current budget to allocate funding to the roads and streets, overnight or in a cycle like this. And I think it's obviously it's important to note the ARPA got us some extra, but we need to continue to build on that within our own budget. And I think one of the concerns that I do have is the longer the ARPA funds sit in that account, right, and that they're available, I think there's greater likelihood that they get reallocated at some point, perhaps by a future council, to go to some other measure. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we are in fact spending that money and making those investments in our road conditions today to the extent we can. So those are just a few comments and thoughts that I had.
Okay, thank you. There's our budget is expanded by over 9% in city expenditures. It's far above today's modern record inflation of 8.5%. There are obvious budget increases in absorbing our own fire command and the previously discussed laborious increases in liability insurance. And this is all without budgeting for street and road repair or infrastructure improvements at all. So I do concur with the rest of the council members that I'd recommend we budget it accordingly moving forward if that's possible, and make sure the council priorities are recognized in real time. That said, I did, is that the end of the presentation, or do we still have more? I did have one other thing, and I think this is really important to recognize this evening. There's a wider benefit to our city by having a competitive workforce. There's a trickle-down impact theory that exists tangibly for our residents and businesses when we pay city employees what exists in the current market. We ask for increases in efficiency by demonstrating through real-world actions that we value our city staff. This is a critical step to employee retention and recruitment, which is a problem for us right now. And it'll show those who have been loyal to our city that we acknowledge their faith. So I want to direct staff to do a classification and compensation study, bring that back to council as soon as possible. I'd like to see where we are in the marketplace. If we're par or way below.
The class and comp study, the fee for the consultant is already baked into the base 22-23 budget. So as soon as budget is adopted, we can start bidding that project out.
Very good.
Ms. Mayor, I do have a question.
Councilman.
Since we were on infrastructure here, can we get just a little update on the light grid situation? I know there was a lot of issues with the. Is that Meg? He's pointing at you, I think.
I think it's partly because there's no funding for it, so he doesn't have a project.
Yeah, I mean, can we just get a little update for the community who are watching right now and who've asked about this, and when can we expect to fix our light infrastructure? And because it's not just the roads. I mean, when we talk infrastructure, it's a lot more that's that's
The
needed?
series lighting is a lighting system and a design that was installed back in the 50s and 60s. And we have thousands of lights here in the city of Fullerton that are in that series light. And for those of us that are old enough to understand a Christmas tree light, that the Christmas tree lights where one bulb comes out and the string no longer works, it's similar to that. So we have whole neighborhoods where when either the power is affected or lights go out on the system, the entire system goes down. Edison is responsible for the power that supplies to the system, and we are responsible for the wiring and all the lights throughout those blocks of neighborhoods. When these lighting systems go out, essentially, the lighting system is so old and antiquated that the manufacturers no longer create and produce those transformers for Edison that feed the system. So the entire systems need to be replaced, obviously. And I was doing a little research before the outdoor dining item that we did the few meetings ago. And as I looked at the prior videos for City Council, another public works person was presenting on the series lighting and the $20 million that existed in 2012 that needed to be addressed. That same issue still exists, and there is no funding for it. It's a $35 million cost is what we anticipate. We are looking and researching whether or not we can we've already talked to the CEC to see if we could get any kind of loan funding for these systems to be replaced. But obviously it takes a revenue stream to make that debt service. Separately, NORESCO, the Energy Efficiency Study Project, is looking at designing one of the systems for us so that we can pursue grant funding to see what it costs to replace. We're also investigating the possibility of solar systems where there is no tree canopy. Here in Fullerton, we have the benefit of this beautiful tree canopy, so there aren't a lot of places where we can remove the series lighting and replace it with solar, but we are looking at all of those options. That's a long way of saying there currently is not a funding source for this, but when we have the design, we plan to pursue grant funding opportunities.
And there was the design, the NORESCO project and the design of it. I remember when we were discussing the ARPA funds, there was still short of $2 million that you needed, right?
Well, they will do the design. There is no money at all identified at this moment for the actual replacement of the system. And you did mention that people were asking questions. We do currently have 4 series lighting systems that are being affected right now. And our website, we update on a weekly basis each one of those systems and where we are, what Edison is giving us in terms of their replacement of the transformer or their investigation of their side of the system. And so for updates, they can go to the website, and we also have separate emailing lists. So if you want to get on our list, we're glad to send you out information and provide you updates. And we do appreciate our citizens' patience as we go through this process and understand it's very impactful when their neighborhoods are dark.
Yeah, definitely. It's a public safety issue, especially in certain neighborhoods where it gets really dark, and there were already some issues there. I really would like, I appreciate the updates on the website and all of that, but at some point I think we need to fix the problem. So I really hope that we can start pushing towards those solutions for that particular one. It looks like it might have to have its own separate solution to address, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, just want to follow up on that. So you said NORESCO is going to do our planning. Is there an avenue, I guess, and I don't know too much about this, but is there an avenue to help with this if we move forward towards a smart city? I've heard that term quite a bit recently, and I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around it, but is that something where another vendor comes in and we start moving that way and it generates some sort of revenue stream or savings that we can use for these lights? And again, I don't know much about it, so maybe you might. If you don't, that's...
I know what some vendors have told us, that sometimes they'll come in, but what they're proposing is replacement of certain lights that do have these smart city components where they light up, they can highlight evacuation areas, they have cameras available, they have kind of plug and play for future 4G systems, but they're not placed at the same intervals as streetlights. So it's not to say that we shouldn't continue to research, particularly as that industry grows and morphs, but at this moment, it doesn't look like it's a practical application for us in the replacement of these lights.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll now take public comments. Anybody wishing to make public comments on this item, please feel free to do so. Seeing none in chambers, we'll go to Zoom.
No comments in Zoom.
Mr. Gamble again, please.
Mayor, City Council, Curtis Gamble, activist for the homeless and the veterans. I'd just like to say I enjoyed the presentation. I think it was very helpful and very meaningful to the community. But I like to share this with you also. Being an OCTA bus driver for 14 years, a while back, I think that we should include partnerships when we talk about spending money, funding for streets and the infrastructure. And OCTA, I drove the harbor bus line basically for 14 years, 14 years, because it was the busiest line at that time. Buses running every 10 minutes. OCTA is throughout the city, throughout Orange County, I mean. And the buses are very heavy, and they wear out the streets, and so I think that we should include them because most of the service, like for example, they have what they call the streetcar, OCTA streetcar. They have been trying to get Fullerton to partner with them to have the streetcar run up and down Harbor by Disneyland, and this would be great for Fullerton because it would bring in revenue from the tourists. It's a really it would bring in business for the local business, and OCTA is a $1 billion company, and they're very good at getting government contracts, which is something that we are not that good at doing. We have to open our eyes to the fact that, for example, we're building more houses. We don't have as much parking, and this includes Cal State Fullerton. When we're building there and there's not enough parking. So if we can, for example, run the streetcar, the OCTA streetcar, which I think they call it OC streetcar, if we could run it, for example, from the Fullerton parking lot to the college, this would be very helpful because it would give all the students an opportunity to get back to LA or wherever they come from. So we have to look at partnering with different organizations like for example, Goodman Center. When Goodman came here, which is over on Orangethorpe and State College, we didn't ask, this is a $1 billion company. We didn't ask them for anything. I had to come in here and say, hey, we need them to do some of the streets, the infrastructure, and they agreed to it. It was just that simple. You have to ask for these things. So I think, again, we must deal with a lot of large organizations, again, like OCTA, the Goodman Center.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
We're going to bring this back to council. This is a receive and file item.
Mr. Mayor, if I may question, so just for clarification, the rest of the report where the work plans are, we're not going over those. Is that correct?
We gave you a high-level
Fine,
review.
okay.
We could go through that. We'd be here for hours.
No,
But I wanted you to see this
Right.
because it's helpful to see what each department has on their plate. Obviously there's council priorities and we have all those things, but there's also mandates that each department has to follow and implement, and so I wanted you to be able to see the nitty-gritty of what each department needs to accomplish, and it allows us to manage to this as well.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, but there were just a couple of comments on that I wanted to make, and one of them was on item 21 and within the administrative and services department, because and I guess on the priority level, 4 is the lowest, and this is the improve customer service with all departments. And if I'm reading this right, if it's a level 4, that means that's 1's the highest and so forth, correct? So I would like to see if we can figure this out, and because that's some of the complaints we hear is that when you go to planning, when you try to do some work with the city, it's slow. And I know when I've done some work, it hasn't been slow, so, at my house, so I appreciate that. But if it's a 4, I guess, my question would be, how can we get that up to a 1 or a 2 in the next fiscal year so that we start responding to the calls, the requests that we get on a more timely and quicker manner? So that's one there.
Hey, that's free. I like your thinking. That's the first free, no expense item I think you talked about tonight, right?
Well, I don't know. We may have to hire more people, so. But
Costs
and it-
nothing to have a good attitude and,
Yeah,
you know.
and another item, and I'll just mention a couple just for time's sake, but on page 4 on the building, it's same thing. It says, work with Engrove to better define and streamline the permitting workflow. And that's the level 4 as well. And that's one thing that I've heard a lot about developers and so forth. And I know we're short-staffed, and I get that, but if it's a priority number 4, then I'd like to see that move up and give us, if we need a budget allotment, or it may not be free, but something that we can say, okay, this is a level 1 or 2 now versus a 4. And I think that goes for, those items there, item 23 there under building 24, and so forth, just so we can start addressing some of the comments that I've heard out there when we're talking. And I'll do one other item because I know it's getting late. Where'd it go? Yeah, 35. Okay, yeah, this is under Public Works Department number 35, upgrade traffic mitigation fee. And it says on hold, if staffing resources is allowed. So again, that's a number 4, and
It's really 4 because 4 means it's a department-driven goal.
Okay.
Versus a council priority. So it's something that we want to accomplish. As you know, we've had an entire turnover of that staff and that
Right.
team member. So we're refilling as we go.
all right, and I'll stop there, but I've got a few more that I'll share
All right.
with you at a
Thank you.
later time. But thank you.
So this is the first step in a lot, multi-pronged process. It's going to be, waged out, hopefully not as long as last year. Again, this is a receive and file item, so
Mr. Mayor, if I may, I did ask some questions, but I do have some comments, if I may. And
please, go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you. So I would like, I'd like us to start looking at the budget from a needs point of view. And I know this has been mentioned, and I appreciate that, because the budget, as balanced as it may be, it really doesn't matter to a resident if there's not enough public safety or park maintenance or services. So in order for us to pride ourselves with a balanced budget, we need it to reflect the need that is in the community right now. We have issues like speeding, for example, in streets where certain streets don't qualify for either bumps or other speeding mitigation measures. And in talking to our chief, usually what you have is a motorcycle unit that tends to change the driver's behaviors over time. So I'd like us, if we are prioritizing public safety, I'd like us to start seeing that motorcycle unit come back, because it is essential in areas where speeding is driver behavior driven. Forgive the pun. And these are issues that you see all the time. I mean, I'm not saying this because something I want. It's something that I hear from neighbors all the time, and residents who are almost run over, for example, and then are afraid for their kids who are playing in the street. But then, for example, Baker Avenue has become sort of a parallel sort of street to Orangethorpe, and people are taking it as a way to get from the west side to the east side. And that's a residential street, and they're speeding there. But it doesn't qualify for any particular speeding mitigation measures. So again, this is very important. The other thing is, for example, when you're looking at Parks and Rec, and there's 2 issues that I'm seeing here. Community access. I know there are some residents who have not been able to access the swimming pools, and it's a shortage of staffing. So we need, if we are to provide good services, we need to make sure that we are providing the staffing levels needed for that. The other thing is on park maintenance. We have a lot of parks that need maintenance, but in this budget here presentation, the numbers are, we have four people assigned to landscaping for the entire city, one person assigned to medians, and then one for trash removal. I mean, we have a very large city. Once a month maintenance of parks is not enough, especially in areas where we know there's a lot of activity in it. We see that in Independence Park, Richmond Park, Woodcrest Park, Ford Park. All of these need a lot of maintenance. Areas with high traffic and high level of activity, economic activity. Again, Orangethorpe and Harbor, Brookhurst and Orangethorpe. Those are commercial centers that and others throughout the city. I'm just mentioning some of the most immediate ones that I was driving around over the weekend to look at some of the needs. But we need to make sure that they are clean and they are so that it attracts business and not turns away residents and people and businesses. When we look at economic development, if we are prioritizing that, we need to make sure that arts and culture is a component of it, because it does create jobs, and it also is an attraction that brings even more business and more residents from outside our city to spend their dollars here. Also, if we are to invest in economic development, it has to be for businesses who are coming to invest in our city, that we need to be a business-friendly city. That means expedited processes, and that means more staffing positions in the economic divisions. And the again, I just want to go back to the idea that this has to be a reflection of what is needed in the community. And I encourage, and I know many of our staff and our department heads, the ones we still have at this point, I know we're looking forward to beefing up our staffing levels. But I encourage you to speak also to the community partners that we have in the city, to listen to them and to listen to the needs, because those are the people we are serving. And we have a lot of community partners that, and as much as I was encouraged to see so many people come out on the day of Love Fullerton and do all these projects around, but it also saddened me that we have so much that we are relying on people to come out and volunteer once a year. We need to be proactive, and our budget has to be reflective of that proactivity. So that is what I have to say, and I appreciate everything that our staff is doing, and I appreciate our city manager, acting city manager's work on this, and all the thought that is behind this. So thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, I have a few comments. One is that I'm still concerned about the reduced hours of availability to the public of planning and development and some other departments in the city. Effectively, they're available about half the time, a little less than half the time. And I'd like to see that changed, because if we're talking about economic stimulation, I think we're really hobbling ourselves there. Also, what's interesting about those areas is they're largely self-funded by fees and charges. So when we make those departments unavailable, it is a monopoly in this city. Customers can't go elsewhere. So if we need to be more responsive, I think those hours need to be restored to more availability for the public at large. The second thing is, I've heard trial balloon a few times tonight about tax increases. And I think it's important in budgeting to understand you need to live within your means. And it's barely 17 months ago that a large tax increase was floated the last election cycle. And that administration rolled the dice. 4 of the 5 council members supported it. 2 of those council members aren't with us anymore. But we need to perform first before we could even expect the public to be willing to throw more revenue at some of these problems. So at least in terms of holding out for that eventuality, I think we need to get real with our budgeting for this year. And we'll keep trying to move in the direction of building public trust so that at some point that could be considered, at least to put out before the public again. But it almost is a disrespect for the verdict of the public just, about a year and a half ago. And that's it, Mr. Mayor.
All right, sir.
And Mr. Mayor, if I may, before you finish off.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on a couple of things that Mr. Zara and Mr. Whitaker mentioned. And I was going to talk about our Parks and Rec department, and it's one of these tabs. But yeah, we need to make sure we're providing the services. And same with the police. I live off Chapman, and every night these cars are zooming 100 miles per hour down there. And what Mr. Whitaker said about opening up more hours, yeah, that was one of the things I also had was about our library and our passport service. I know that's self-funding, and we actually make money on that. So hopefully we can ramp that up if it's not already to do that. And with that, I'll pass it forward.
All right, very well. We'll draw this meeting to a close. Next meeting scheduled is May 3rd, Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel. Good night, folks.